Carol is going to come to read to us. If you've got a device, open it to 1 Corinthians 10. There are Bibles on the side as well. If you'd like one, do grab one from there. But 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in this cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered all over the desert. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test the Lord, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. So, if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one loaf, we, who are many, are one body, for we all partake of the one loaf. Consider the people of Israel. Do not those who eat the sacrifices participate in the altar? Do I mean then that a sacrifice offered to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. Are we trying to arouse the Lord's jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. Nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If some unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if anyone says to you, "This has been offered in sacrifice," then do not eat it, both for the sake of the man who told you and for conscience sake. The other man's conscience, I mean, not yours. For why should my freedom be judged by another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everybody in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, thank you, Carol, for that mammoth Bible reading. That was brilliant. Thank you very much. Now it's just my job to unpack it. No pressure at all. Absolutely fantastic. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. My name's Gemma, for anyone who doesn't know me. This morning, I'm going to be speaking about living in God's freedom. So what that means, what it looks like, and how we do it. So we're going to jump right into that this morning. But before we do, I have a question to ask you. So if I say the word freedom, what thoughts, words, or images come to mind? Speak to the person next to you for a minute. Okay, I'm not going to get you to feedback, but I imagine that things like being released from prison were said, or maybe like coming away from under some kind of oppression, or potentially maybe you said something about not having to follow rules or regulations or laws or that kind of thing. Maybe you said some stuff like that. Did any of those things come up? Yeah, ish, maybe not. Maybe you guys are just really holy and are talking about God's version of freedom already. But I imagine that most of the time when we think about the word freedom and what that means, we think about it being something about taking away rules or regulations or oppression or boundaries or that kind of thing so that we can do what we want. And this is what the world's version of freedom looks like. Whenever freedom is talked about on the news, by politicians, on social media, maybe even in the home, it's usually about having the ability to do whatever we want and taking away anything that might stop us from being able to do so. And this kind of freedom is something that is promoted as a really positive thing by the world. Something that every single person has the right to identify as whatever we want, the right to be whatever we want, the right to do whatever we want, the right to say whatever we want. And to suggest anything otherwise is seen as hateful, unloving, and discriminatory. But God's version of freedom is very different to the world's. Let me take you right back to the beginning, all the way back in the creation story. God makes it very clear that for him, freedom does involve boundaries that are set by him. God tells the first human in Genesis chapter 2 that although he is free to eat anything that he wants in the Garden of Eden, he is not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if he does so, he will die, which we later see means that he'll be separated from close relationship with God, who is our creator and our life source. The original plan was that humans would not experience separation from God at all, and therefore would be completely free to be everything that God had created us to be. The boundaries that God gave back then were to protect them from experiencing the lack of freedom that death or separation from him brings. And that's a state that he did not design us to live in. But if we know the story, we will know that the first humans were led to question the fact that God had given them boundaries and his reasons for doing so. And they did exactly what God had told them not to do. And so sin or rebellion against God and death or separation from God entered the world, and with them, the lack of freedom that they both bring. And ever since then, God has been at work to restore our freedom. It's why Jesus entered the world in human form, gave his life on the cross, and rose again. He did so to free us from the chains of sin and death. And whilst doing so, he also demonstrated what living in this freedom from sin and death looks like. It looks like living under the rule and reign of the Father and the boundaries that he gives. Living under God's rule and reign is what brings us freedom. Doing what we wanted was what got us into the mess in the first place. And so it's really ironic that this is so much of what the world thinks freedom looks like. Doing whatever we want isn't freedom at all. In fact, most of the time, it leads to complete and utter chaos. Freedom to God is about being free from the power that sin and death has over our lives. And so my question for us this morning is, are we living in the freedom that God has for us? To help us understand more of what this freedom looks like and how to live in it, let's jump into the Bible passage that Cal read so beautifully this morning. The first few verses take us back to the story of the people of Israel. We are reminded that God freed them from slavery in Egypt, brought them through the Red Sea to the foot of Mount Sinai, where he gave them instructions that would enable them to live differently to the world around them, and therefore to represent him. However, the first 5 verses of this passage remind us that even though God rescued them from slavery, even though they saw all the amazing miracles that he did, even though they received his provision of food and water when they were in the desert, God was not pleased with most of them. And they didn't enter the promised land or live in the freedom that he had in store for them. We read in verses 6 to 10 a number of stories of the Israelites worshipping other gods, disobeying God sexually, whinging and complaining about God's ways, and not recognizing or appreciating what he had done for them. Despite having been physically freed from slavery to Egypt, they did not step into freedom from slavery to sin. And therefore, God was unhappy with how they were representing him to the world around them. They received worldly freedom, but they didn't receive the spiritual freedom that was available to them. And I wonder whether, because they'd spent so many years in slavery, perhaps they had such a limited understanding and vision of what freedom looked like, that once they received physical freedom, they were happy to just settle for that, and not to seek the greater freedom that was available to them in God. And I wonder if that is also true for us today in the Western world. Yes, many of us who call ourselves Christians will have encountered God in different ways throughout our faith journey. We'll have experienced him providing for us like the Israelites did. And we'll have received by faith the freedom that has been offered to us through the power of the cross. But we may have come to a standstill at this point. Maybe we've become complacent or don't know how to live in the power of that freedom, or we don't want to put in the effort that's needed to do so. Maybe, like the Israelites, our vision and understanding of what freedom looks like is limited, and so we aren't even aware of the power of the freedom available to us in Christ. In the Western world, we are physically free to pretty much do whatever we want, aren't we? We don't really receive persecution for our faith. We live in a world where the pursuit of pleasure is encouraged, and any reverence for God is pretty absent from our society. And if our understanding and our vision of what freedom looks like remains at just being able to do whatever we want, as the world portrays it to be, then we're likely to settle and to remain pretty content with a version of Christianity where we just come to church and read our Bible when we feel like it, or maybe we just do the Christian ministry and practices that make us feel good at the time, and maybe where we ignore the fact that in so many ways we are still slaves to sin. But God has so much more for us, church. He doesn't want us to settle for a version of Christianity that blinds us to the fullness of the freedom that we could experience in him. He wants us to understand that true freedom is only available through him. And if we're willing to mature and put in the work it takes to live in this freedom, because it does take work, it takes quite a lot of work actually, then we will be his representatives to the world in the same way that Israel was called to be. And so before we think about how we might go about living in this freedom, we need to understand a bit more about sin and how it keeps us captive. Sin is the act of rebelling against God, and essentially it all originates from the worship of idols, the putting of something else in what should be God's place in our lives. God is our creator. He is the one through whom we exist, the one who loves us above all else, and therefore the only one we should worship and look to as King of our lives and of the world. This is why the first 4 commandments, or if you want to call them laws, instructions, whatever you want to call them, the ones that were given to the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai are about ensuring they recognize God as their Savior and worship Him and Him alone. They're not there because God is an egomaniac and needs to be validated in some way. They're there because He knows that as soon as we look to something and someone else in that place of worship, sin enters and disaster follows. We see example after example of this in the story of Israel. And as I said earlier, a number of these examples are included in verses 6 to 10 in this passage. This is also exactly what happened to Adam and Eve, those first humans in the Garden of Eden. They allowed the serpent to fuel their own desires to be in that place of worship, to be the king of their lives instead of God. And as a result, sin entered. They disobeyed what God had told them to do. They created separation between them and Him, and they lost their freedom. They gave in to the idol that every single one of us tends to worship above all, the idol of self. Now, when idols are mentioned in this passage, they're physical figures, usually made out of gold or bronze or some kind of precious metal, that have been created by human hands to represent gods other than the God of the Bible. People in the ancient world would pray to these figures, would offer things to them, would sacrifice to them as their way of worshipping or serving these other gods. This would have been the Israelites' understanding and experience of idols, and the understanding of idols that those reading Paul's words here during the first century would have had. We may not create physical idols today to represent the things that we worship other than God, but human nature is the same. And we continue to worship and serve many other things in God's place. I would argue, though, that despite the fact that if we were creating physical idols today, they would represent things like money or power or sex or fame or pleasure, all of those things have become so important because we have decided that they're worth spending time on or worth putting in God's place or worth disobeying His instructions on. And we make those decisions because we have decided that we are the king of our lives rather than God. We've decided that we are the ones who should decide what is good and bad, and therefore how we end up acting. And so all of these different idols are actually offspring of the idol of self. Because if we were to think about it, we would recognize that these things become so important in our lives and end up having such a hold on us because we're using them to try and meet our needs in our own strength rather than looking to God to do so. We're so caught up in different sins because we've decided that we want to be in charge of our own lives, and so we need to work out how to handle things ourselves. We focus upon and pursue money above all things because we want to create our own security and don't look to God to provide our needs. We strive for power because we want to control our own lives. We don't want to trust God and His ways. We're obsessed with sex because we need to feel loved or wanted and don't want to look to God to receive this. We seek fame because we want to know that we have worth and we don't look to God to find that worth in Him. We pursue pleasure because we want joy and happiness and don't believe that we can find that if we do things God's way. The list could go on and on and on for anything else that becomes a recurring sin or what we might call an idol in our lives. And the truth is that due to our human desire to want to be the king of our lives, and therefore our tendency to do things our own way rather than God's, certain sins can become ingrained in our nature and can feel as if they are impossible to break free from. We can feel as if we have no power over them, and they can become such second nature that we can even get to a point where we barely notice that they are an issue anymore. We see this where there are addictions to certain sins or sins that seem like a cycle that happen over and over and over again. But we also see this in sins like gossip or lying or ways we might try to manipulate and control others. Because these sins are less obvious in their destructiveness and therefore more socially acceptable, we often don't recognize the bondage they are keeping us in and how they might separate us from God and prevent us from living in the freedom that He wants us to live in so that we can be everything that He's created us to be. And so we need to open our eyes and we need to be willing to do the work to deconstruct the idol of self, surrender our flesh to Jesus, and so that we can live in the freedom that He has for us. But the big question is how? How do we go that next step beyond receiving by faith the freedom that Jesus has given us through the cross and actively living in it? I've come up with 3 things that I think we can do to help us to do this. The first thing we need to do is to decide that we are actively going to look to God as the one who is king of and therefore in charge of our lives. We're going to choose to live the way that He instructs us to, no matter how different that may be to what we want or what we think is best. This requires us to release control of our lives and to entrust that control to God. And that's pretty hard for me. I don't know about you. And even if we have the greatest desire to do this in the world, it will still be hard. Because our ability to do so essentially boils down to the following question. Do we believe that He is good? Do we believe that He is good? If we're going to be able to release control of our own lives and surrender to God, then we need to know right deep down in the depths of our being that He is good, that He loves us, that He wants what is best for us, and He's going to have our best interests in mind at all times. I'm sure that most of us in this room would say, of course we believe that He is good, and to a point, yes, we may believe that. But do we truly believe that deep down, right in the depths of our very core? Because if we did, then there wouldn't be areas of our lives that we're not willing to release control of. We would be willing to live the ways that He instructs us to in the Bible about absolutely everything. We wouldn't be trying to make that dream for the future happen in our own strength. We would release it to God and trust in His timing. We wouldn't be holding on to that grudge that we think we have a right to dwell on because the person hurt us. We would forgive as God has asked us to and trust in His ways of grace, mercy, and justice. We wouldn't be making our own plans for what ours or our children's lives are going to look like in 5 years' time. We would be asking God to lead us. Putting and keeping God in His rightful place as King of our lives is a gradual, lifelong process. It requires us to set aside our pride every day and to acknowledge that God knows better than us in all things. It requires us to trust in His love for us and believe that all His ways are in our best interests. It's a very vulnerable place to be. But I know from experience that it's also the place of complete contentment. There are definitely areas of my life that I'm still holding on to control in, many of which I'm probably unaware of at this moment, and I'm trusting God to reveal to me in His timing. But overall, I can say that I have surrendered my life to Him and look to Him as King. I want to live my life this way. I want to live my life His way. I do believe that He is good and that He loves me, even when things don't go my way. And I can honestly say that the more I release control of different areas of my life to God, the more content I become. Some of you may have heard me speak about my singleness in the past and how painful it has been at times. But the further I go on this journey of surrendering to God as King, the more content I become in that singleness. I trust that he loves me and has so much beauty for me in singleness, and the more I believe it, the more I experience it. The next thing we need to do, so number 2, to live in the freedom that God has for us, is allow him to meet our needs rather than trying to meet them in our own strength. Many of the different sins we wrestle with are due to us failing to go to God to meet our needs and trying to meet them through worldly means. And the reason we don't go to him to meet our needs essentially boils down to the following question: do we believe that he's able? Do we believe that he's able? We're bombarded with advertising, social media posts, news articles, and much more that feeds us the lie that our needs can be met through the latest gadget or product, a relationship, sex, a holiday in the sunshine, having the perfect body, etc., 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 etc. I'm not saying that any of those things are necessarily completely bad in themselves. But when we look to those things to meet our needs for love, for security, for worth, affection, joy, whatever it might be, instead of going to God for those things, then we're essentially saying that we don't believe that he's able to meet those needs. I've recently gotten really into fitness, and I've started going to the gym very regularly. Initially, I was working out more because I wanted to lose the weight that I put on during the pandemic. Maybe some other people can relate, I don't know. But it's now become more about health and fitness, as I'm loving having more stamina and the endorphins that exercise gives me. But I do need to be careful that I don't fall into the trap of comparing my body to others at the gym and looking to get thinner or more toned because looking a certain way gives me a sense of worth. I know that my worth comes from God and that I have value because he created me in his image, not because of my six-pack. I also need to be careful that I don't start using exercise as a way of manufacturing positive emotions instead of looking to God as my source of joy. I know that true joy only comes from him, not from the high I feel after a run. However, there are times when I can look to exercise to meet those needs rather than God, as it can sometimes be difficult to believe that he is able, due to us not being able to physically see, hear, or touch him. I recognise that when we have the need for physical touch or a word of encouragement or someone to just sit next to us in our moments of pain, it might seem impossible for God to meet that need. But through the person of the Holy Spirit, God can be physically present in our lives. And in those moments of need, I believe he can and does feel tangibly close. But even when he doesn't, because he doesn't always, the roots of all our needs can be met in God if we are willing to go to him and to do the work that is needed to allow him access. Living in God's freedom requires us to do some work. That's point number 3. Point number 1 was look to God as our King. Point number 2 was allow him to meet our needs. Point number 3 is be willing to do the work. Like I said already, ensuring God is King of our lives is a daily process of setting aside our pride and releasing control. Allowing him to meet our needs means being willing to reflect upon our own actions and behaviour and acknowledge where we might be wrongly relying on what the world is offering. The truth is, being a Christian isn't easy. Yes, it is true that we don't need to do anything but decide to follow Jesus to receive the freedom the cross gives us. Just like the Israelites didn't need to do anything but follow Moses out of Egypt to receive their freedom from slavery. But if we want to live in that freedom, we do need to be willing to do some hard work on ourselves. And our willingness to do so essentially boils down to this question: do we believe that he's worth it? Do we believe that he's worth it, church? Do we believe that who God is and what he gives to us is worth the hard work it takes to deconstruct the idol of self? Because I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is painful. It is humbling. It requires sacrifice. It requires self-denial. It requires us to go back to places of trauma and invite God in to heal and to release us from shame. It requires facing our own sin and brokenness and being willing to repent. It requires us to let go of anger towards others, to forgive and to be willing to face our own sin in having held on to bitterness for so long. It requires us to see others as people made in God's image, despite what they may have done. It requires us to try and understand other people's perspectives and how we might have contributed to their pain without even realizing. It requires us to lay down our own desires at God's feet. And it requires living his way, no matter how challenging we may find it. But I wouldn't be standing here and saying all this if I didn't think he was worth it. Being willing to do the hard work means that we will have an intimacy of relationship with God that is a greater prize than anything this world can offer. It brings with it true contentment, an assuredness of being fully known and fully loved, and peace that surpasses all understanding. It also brings freedom from sin and the effects sin has on our lives. It is true that whilst we live on this earth, we will never be fully free from sin. That's to come when we enter heaven. But we can become less prone to sin and more prone to living God's way. And we can become more free of insecurities, of shame, of concerns about what other people think, of worries and of fear. The fact that all this is available to us, if we're willing to do the work, tells me that beyond a shadow of a doubt, yes, he is worth it. And so, as we close, let's think about the impact us living in this freedom might have beyond ourselves. Clearly, there are a lot of benefits to us if we're willing to do the work to live in God's freedom, but the benefit isn't for us alone. A large chunk of the passage we've been looking at today talks about being aware of others and how our lives may impact them. The freedom God has for us isn't just for our own benefit, it's for the benefit of the world around us, so that, as it says in verse 33, many may be saved. Israel wasn't rescued from slavery in Egypt and then instructed to live a certain way just for their own benefit. Yes, God did that because he loved them, but it was also bigger than that. He also did it so they could be his representatives to the world around them. He wanted them to live in his freedom so that the world would see his character of love through them. And that's what he wants for us too. This freedom isn't just for us, it's so the world around us can see the beauty of the nature of our God shining through us. And if we want to do a better job than we're doing right now, because if we're honest, the church in the Western world doesn't have a great reputation for representing God's well. But if we want to do a better job, then we need to be willing to do the work, to live in the freedom that Jesus has made available to us. I pray that you will make the decision to look to God as King of your life, to allow him to meet your needs, and to do the work needed to step into the freedom available to you with me this morning.